Good evening. I'm Jan McDaniel, musical director of Painted Sky Opera in quarantine with my quarantine lack of haircut. Here to set the stage for this evening's webcast of the Metropolitan Opera's beautiful production of La Traviata. We're not supposed to have favorites, but I unabashedly say that my favorite opera, without question, is Verdi's La Traviata. I find the score indestructible. Even when I've been at a miserably poor performance in the audience, I have always managed to be moved by the music that Verdi provides. There's not a note out of place, and there's not a note extra in the score. It's perfection. And I'm just going to spend a few moments giving you some of my impressions about what makes this opera so spectacular. And I want to start by just talking to you about a theme that pervades the opera. And it's a very simple theme. I'm going to play it here on my piano, and I hope this comes through. That's simply a descending major scale, followed by that little falling interval right there. Simple, so simple that is in fact considered in the 19th century coin of the realm. One finds that same phrase in various configurations rhythmically in the operas of Bellini and Donizetti. When Verdi wrote it, he wasn't writing what he thought was a brand new idea. He was just simply picking up stock currency, just as composers in the 1950s in pop music used the 1-6-2-4 turnaround phrase over and over again and considered it to be fair game. But Verdi, by choosing that phrase to build this entire opera, transfixed that theme in our minds. It says everything that is discussed in this opera. The relationships involved with the characters and the trouble that ensues. Let's start, before we talk in detail about that, let's talk about the title, La Traviata, or as we often say, La Traviata. We don't translate that title. Most operas, we know often the original title, but we all affectionately call, say, The Barber of Seville instead of Il Barbiere di Siviglia. But we always say La Traviata because that's a difficult title to translate. It means something like the wayward woman. And it's, of course, a reference to the title character based on the real-life courtesan that Dumas met in Paris. She was a kept woman, and she had developed consumption, tuberculosis, and we see basically the last portion of her life play itself out during the course of this opera, in which very, very many things happen in a fairly tight amount of time. She has just recovered from a bout of the disease at the beginning of the opera when she meets the man who will be the love of her life. Love is something she has not really had a chance to know. And she meets this young man. She's been aware of the fact that he has checked on her during her illness, and when she's in this sort of finally this party that she throws sort of in honor of her recovery, she has a chance to have an encounter with this young man, which results in love. All through this opera, this theme will pervade. We hear it in the prelude. it's repeated often enough with the counterpoint of other lines in the score that sort of give us an idea of Violetta's previous life, which is coquettish. Meanwhile, that same tune is happening. And so forth. We'll hear a little of the excerpt of the prelude right now, played by the full orchestra, to give you an idea of the power of this moment, where these two worlds intersect. The love that will be coming into her life meets her approach to life before, which is live fast, have a good time. And so before a note is sung, Verdi has set this opera up with the counterpoint that is to establish it. The story then develops at the end of the first act. The two have their first love duet, and Violetta is left alone to decide whether this is actually the time to follow love. In her famous act-ending aria, "È strano, a forse lui," perhaps he is the one, a forse lui, and then she rejects his love at the end of the aria by saying, "Sempre libera de Dio." No, the answer is not love. The answer is freedom, my freedom. Of course, as we know, because we love this opera, freedom is not what wins, but she follows her heart. I'm saying all of this because in the midst of this decision that she's making in this aria, after they've had their love duet, she recalls something that the tenor sang to her in the middle of the love duet, which is basically an elaborated form of the same phrase we heard at the beginning of the opera. Just taking that same basic shape and adding some passing tones and changing the rhythm and creating another motive. That now represents the love of Alfredo, the young man she meets, for her. So in the midst of her decision in this act-ending aria at the end of the first act, the tenor is heard, normally off stage, you only hear his voice, singing a reprise of this aria. Interestingly, accompanied by the harp. And the only thing the harp plays in this entire opera is this little off-stage quote from this aria. And it gives her pause. Right in the middle of the time when she's decided she's going to be free, she hears that voice, and it beckons to her. And it continually beckons to her. She's pulled. continues to voice this. And then, of course, the act ends. And when the curtain goes up on Act 2, who do we see? We see Alfredo, the young man. And he makes reference to the fact that, that they've been together now for 3 months, living out in the country. We realize that, of course, love has won the day. I'm going to talk now about something that a lot of people don't notice and don't think is significant in bel canto opera, and how important I think it is to bel canto opera in general, and specifically to Verdi. And that is pas accompaniments. The first day I sit with a cast of Traviata, and I can't remember how many I've done. I talk about the fact that Traviata is an opera about heartbeats. And as I see it, all the way through the opera, pervading all of these themes that we find, there's just basically something that's constantly there. And one can say, well, that's simply what happens in bel canto opera. The orchestra is, as Donizetti once said, a giant guitar that accompanies these beautiful tunes and has very little involvement. But I don't see it that way. I see these accompaniment patterns as depicting the pulses of the characters. And I think in Traviata, we're particularly aware of that because we experience Violetta's growing love, where the pulses are present, and then the pulse picks up at the end of the first act when she's saying she wants her freedom. We hear, and we can say, yes, maybe that's just an idea of freedom, but perhaps it's also a quickening pulse because she feels so incredibly alive. So as the opera progresses, and you'll see the opera as you experience it. Spoiler alert, the soprano dies at the end of the opera. But at the moment at which she's sort of at death's door, here's what happens in the orchestra. So as she is saying her last words, in a sense, basically giving Alfredo permission to love again and saying goodbye to him, her pulse is weak. And so we have Verdi doing this incredibly powerful thing. He has every single instrument in the orchestra playing. And the accompaniment is simply this, and we'll hear this in just a moment with the orchestra. But it's marked pianissimo, 4 P's. If you know music, 3 P's is the superlative, pianissimo. And so pianissimo is an exaggeration, as softly as they can play, and they're playing a halted pulse because this is all she has left. As she's saying her final words. And then, of course, what often is said to happen near the end of the tuberculosis, the consumption in those days when it was untreatable, there's a feeling of being completely okay. And so at that very moment, after this little pulse figure is over, there is a moment in which the umpas are gone. It's simply a tremolo in the strings. And listen to what the orchestra is playing. That original tune. As she breathes what are to be her last breaths, the pulse is gone, but that tune, that love, is still there, pervading the atmosphere. And of course, when she collapses on a glorious final high B flat, the orchestra returns and plays what are sort of typical tragedy cadences. Nevertheless, we're left with this feeling of this incredible life experienced by this soprano. I think we'll close by listening to a little bit of this final moment. And I've just scratched the surface in this little bit of time that I have to talk to you today. But I hope you enjoy this performance and that you think about what the orchestra is doing, those tunes that pervade, but particularly be cognizant of the rhythm, the umpas, the pulse of this piece. And notice how that pulse mirrors the character's feelings as the production progresses. Enjoy the opera.